Horatio Pilkington lived on the top floor of a rickety old apartment building on Maplewood Lane. Generations of the same wallpaper had flaked off these walls, and the plumbing groaned as if each pipe was about to give its last breath. Despite his shabby dwelling, Horatio prided himself on maintaining a certain air of dignity. He wore freshly polished shoes every Sunday, slicked his hair back with too much pomade, and patted invisible dust flecks off his lapel whenever he met someone new. He loved the idea of projecting an image of carefully curated respectability. In truth, his life was much more ordinary and, at times, humiliating than he would ever admit. His one real mark of eccentricity was his pet, a magenta and green parrot named Marigold. He had found Marigold a few months earlier, caged in an obscure pet shop that specialized in exotic birds. The shop smelled like boiled cabbage and stale peanuts. One glance at the parrot's shimmering feathers and Horatio had been smitten. He shelled out a shocking amount of money for a creature that squawked loudly and dropped feathers like confetti. Back in his creaky apartment, he positioned Marigold on a wooden perch by the window, certain that the parrot's color and chatty nature would elevate his social standing among the neighbors. He imagined guests admiring this exotic bird as a sign of refined taste. What Horatio hadn't counted on was the bird's uncanny ability to pick up more than just polite chit-chat. From the moment he brought Marigold home, the parrot had listened to every phone call, eavesdropped on every conversation, and become intimately aware of Horatio's daily routines. It was all entertainment for Marigold, like an ongoing soap opera, but with slightly more drama and fewer commercial breaks. And soon enough, Marigold began to repeat things. It started innocently enough. "Horatio needs coffee, Squawk," was the first phrase. Then came "unbelievable date last night," which prompted Horatio to blush furiously when it happened in front of his neighbor, who was definitely not the one he'd had the date with. At first, it was just mildly amusing. Horatio laughed off the parrot's chatter, telling himself that nobody was really paying attention. After all, parrots repeat nonsense all the time. But Marigold's memory soon proved to be alarmingly accurate. The bird seemed to single out only the most embarrassing morsels of information for broadcast. Conversations that Horatio had assumed were private and definitely wanted kept private suddenly became the parrot's favorite lines. It was as if Marigold had an instinct for comedic timing and maximum mortification. The day things took a bizarre turn started off innocently. Horatio woke late after forgetting to set his alarm. He shuffled around the apartment, cursing softly under his breath as he searched for a left sock that had somehow disappeared in the laundry. He found it behind the radiator, clinging to a dust bunny large enough to name and claim as a pet. While Horatio yanked at the sock, Marigold cocked its head and let out a few quiet chirps. Then, in a perfectly pitched imitation of Horatio's voice, the parrot repeated, "It's not a wig, it's a hairpiece." Horatio froze. He nearly bumped his head against the radiator, then stood up, sock in hand. Panic pulsed in his neck. It was true, he'd once confided in a friend that he wore a discreet hairpiece to correct a pesky thinning patch near the back of his head. The conversation took place over the phone, late at night after a few too many glasses of cheap scotch. But how had Marigold picked that up so precisely? More importantly, had others heard? He tried to console himself that it was a fluke. Perhaps Marigold had just strung random words together. All morning, Horatio hovered near the bird, repeatedly whispering, "You are a handsome parrot. Who wants a cracker?" in an attempt to overwrite the incriminating phrase. Marigold seemed amused, bobbing its head as though politely humoring Horatio before squawking, "Must hide the bald spot." Horatio's heart leaped into his throat. Indeed, the parrot was not only a mimic but a deviant archivist of humiliations. Horatio rushed out of the apartment that afternoon for an important appointment at his insurance job. It was policy renewal season, so he braced himself for anxious customers and endless paperwork. Still, visions of his talking parrot spouting humiliating secrets to anyone who happened to pass by his open window clutched at his mind. The dread was almost enough to make him call in sick. But he trudged forward, hoping that maybe the bird would just fall asleep or decide to talk about the weather. Several hours later, the entire office was well aware of Horatio's predicament. As he was preparing to head out for his lunch break, his coworker Brenda approached him, biting back a grin. She leaned in and whispered, Does the phrase, "It's not a wig, it's a hairpiece," mean anything to you? Horatio nearly dropped his stapler. Before he could sputter a denial, Brenda explained that one of their coworkers who happened to live just across the street had heard some very strange squawking from Horatio's open window. Apparently, word traveled fast in office gossip circles, and now there was no unringing that bell. By the time Horatio arrived home that evening, a few more damning remarks had become part of the parrot's repertoire. He opened the front door to find his neighbor, Ms. Dubois, standing in the hallway, arms folded beneath her floral apron. She had thick glasses perched on the tip of her nose, and an expression that said she wanted answers. The moment Horatio's key turned in the lock, he heard Marigold's booming voice from inside. 4 sneezes in a row! That's a new record. It didn't sound too incriminating until Ms. Dubois pursed her lips and said, 4 sneezes in a row? That's what happened this morning when I sprayed my new perfume, and the walls are thin, you know. Horatio fumbled with his keys and opened the door, letting Ms. Dubois see into his disheveled living space. He forced a smile. Good evening, Ms. Dubois. Sorry if Marigold bothered you. The parrot just likes to talk, you see, she sniffed. Talk indeed. This building has never been so noisy. Once inside, Horatio marched over to Marigold. The parrot blinked its fluorescent eyes. Squawk! Horatio hates his boss, it screeched. Horatio's eyes bugged out and he reflexively clamped a hand over Marigold's beak. The bird slipped out of his grasp and flapped its wings indignantly. Horatio hates his boss. Boss is a lazy pig, it repeated. Breathless, he stared at the door, praying Ms. Dubois was already gone. Then, pressed against the door, he heard the faint footsteps receding. He exhaled and sank into a chair. All right, we're going to have to get you a muzzle or something, he muttered. Marigold ruffled its feathers and let out a single noncommittal chirp. The next day arrived with a wave of scorching summer heat. Horatio woke early, determined to keep Marigold's chatter to a minimum. His best weapon, he decided, would be to fill the parrot's day with educational recordings of classical music or white noise. If he left that playing on loop, maybe Marigold would forget these humiliating segments. So he set up his old boombox near the cage, popped in a dusty Beethoven cassette, and headed off to work. Unfortunately for Horatio, the human ear is not the only one that tires of repetition. By lunchtime, Marigold had apparently grown bored with Beethoven's Fifth and had used its strong beak to nudge the tape eject mechanism. The bird then pressed the play button again, but with no tape inside, the boombox just gave a hiss of static. Undeterred, Marigold let out a theatrical squawk and began entertaining the hallway with a medley of Horatio's greatest humiliations. Neighbors passing by heard things like, Horatio's still afraid of the dark, and Horatio's state said, never call me again, followed by maniacal parrot cackles. Word spread like a brush fire. Fellow tenants who had never before exchanged more than a polite nod in the elevator suddenly found they had a perfect icebreaker, discussing the shortfalls in Horatio Pilkington's personal life. That evening, Horatio returned home under a barrage of knowing smirks and muffled giggles. He almost felt that the building's walls had grown eyes. Walking down the hallway, he heard Ms. Dubois whispering to Mr. Jones, the landlord. It's absolutely scandalous, she hissed. Do you imagine what else the bird might say if we listened longer? Horatio slunk by, trying his best to become invisible, but the real trouble began just then. Mr. Jones hollered after him. Pilkington! I hope you're aware that nuisance pets are not welcome here. If one more complaint comes my way, that parrot might have to go. Horatio nodded stiffly and ducked inside his apartment. Of course, the moment he closed the door, Marigold launched into a new round of revelations. Horatio lost his keys in the freezer next to the ice cream Squawk. Horatio yelped, Will you stop that, please? That was one time. Not helping matters was Horatio's friend Lucy, who had come by to see how he was faring with his new roommate. Lucy was usually the supportive type, but when she overheard Marigold chanting, Lucy can't parallel park, Lucy shot Horatio a pointed look. Well, she said, eyebrows raised, your bird's got quite the memory. Trust me, I'm not happy about it, Horatio groaned. Surely there's a solution. They say covering a parrot's cage at night keeps them quiet, or you can train them with certain phrases. Lucy considered, the problem biting her lip. I've heard that parrots respond to positive reinforcement. Maybe if we reward it for repeating nice things and ignore the mean stuff? Easier said than done, Horatio thought. He tried this approach. Over the next few days, he painstakingly repeated phrases like, Marigold is a good parrot. Horatio is a wonderful guy. Everybody loves Horatio, each time offering the bird a sunflower seed as a reward. For a while it seemed to work. Marigold would bob its head and mimic the kind words, but apparently the seeds weren't enough of an incentive to keep the parrot from eventually blurting, Horatio's boss is a lazy pig, or it's not a wig, it's a hairpiece, whenever Horatio least expected it. The worst part? It wasn't always angry outbursts or humiliating disclaimers. Sometimes the parrot recited personal confessions, like, Horatio cried during that rom-com, even though Horatio would rather face a firing squad than admit he'd teared up at the sappy ending of a movie. The more squeamish or embarrassing the secret, the likelier Marigold was to repeat it in front of an audience. It all came to a head one Saturday evening. Horatio had mustered the courage to throw a small social gathering, hoping to show his neighbors he was more than just the guy with the loudmouth parrot. He cleaned the apartment meticulously, set out a tray of canapes, donned a bow tie, the only one he owned, and placed classical music on low volume. He invited Lucy, a few friends from the insurance office, and even took a chance on inviting Miss Dubois, hoping to smooth matters over. At first, the party was pleasant. Lucy complimented the homemade guacamole. Miss Dubois tested the canapes with a suspicious pinch, but admitted they were tasty. Despite the stifling summer heat, conversation began to flow, and Horatio felt his shoulders relax. Marigold was perched up high on its cage, quietly nibbling a seed. For a moment, Horatio allowed himself to believe the parrot might behave, but as people navigated the cramped living room, Horatio's coworker Oliver made the mistake of asking, So, how's your boss these days? I hear he's quite demanding. That was the cue Marigold was waiting for. Feathers fluffed, it let out a piercing squawk. Then, clear as day in front of Ms. Dubois, Lucy, Oliver, and the rest of the guests, Marigold imitated Horatio's voice, exclaiming, He's a spineless donkey! Plus, I forged his signature last week to skip a meeting. I had a headache. Squawk! Dead silence filled the room. Horatio's eyes went huge. He had, in fact, scribbled his boss's signature on a meeting sign-in sheet so he could leave early. It was a small indiscretion, but hearing it broadcast like a scandal was enough to leave Horatio wishing he could evaporate on the spot. The guests exchanged alarmed glances, especially Ms. Dubois, who let out a disapproving cluck. While Horatio stood frozen, Marigold continued, though in a mostly unintelligible screech. Horatio naps in his office sometimes. Horatio drools on the break room couch. One of his friends coughed nervously, trying to break the tension. Lucy stared at him with open pity. Ms. Dubois sniffed and turned away. Oliver grimaced as if uncertain whether to laugh or run to tattle on him. Finally, Horatio found his tongue. You know parrots always mixing up words, he said, voice trembling. Just a silly coincidence. Please, everyone, eat more guacamole. The evening never recovered. Horatio spent the rest of the party in quiet mortification, half-heartedly pretending that it was all a misunderstanding. Everyone left by 9 p.m., skipping dessert. Marigold had resumed a facade of innocence, occasionally offering a polite, Polly wants a cracker, as if none of the night's humiliations had happened. By Sunday morning, Horatio was in full crisis mode. He spent the first half of the day searching the internet for how to silence a talkative parrot, and can you unteach a parrot embarrassing secrets. He found no quick fixes. He even weighed the possibility of returning Marigold to the pet store, but the shop had a strict no-return policy. Besides, Horatio couldn't deny he'd grown attached to the chatterbox, if only it weren't so eager to sabotage his social standing. Finally, he decided it was time to contact a professional. He found an avian behaviorist named Dr. Rosenthal, who claimed to have experience with difficult parrots. Horatio booked the earliest available appointment and transported Marigold to Dr. Rosenthal's small clinic on the outskirts of town. Inside, the walls were plastered with pictures of exotic birds perched on the shoulders of beaming clients. The air smelled of seed husks and disinfectant. Dr. Rosenthal, the bespectacled woman with frizzy gray hair, guided Horatio and the parrot into a small exam room. Marigold blinked at the unfamiliar surroundings, apparently curious. Dr. Rosenthal began by observing the parrot in silence. Then she said kindly, "So, I hear you have quite the talkative buddy here." "That's one way to put it," Horatio replied, already feeling sweaty under the fluorescent lights. "It's gotten so embarrassing I can't have a conversation with anyone without Marigold, well, blurting out personal information." Dr. Rosenthal nods. Parrots are natural mimics, and they respond to the level of excitement certain words provoke. So, if your parrot notices that saying Horatio Forge's signatures makes you go red in the face, it will repeat that phrase to get a reaction. Horatio slumped. "So, you're saying it's my own fault?" "Not entirely," Dr. Rosenthal said kindly, "but you might be encouraging it with your responses. The key is to extinguish the behavior by focusing on neutral words and ignoring the scandalous phrases." She described a regimented training program involving treat rewards, timeouts, and a carefully controlled environment. Horatio felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps with devotion, patience, and the right guidance, he could salvage some privacy. But fate had other plans. The moment Dr. Rosenthal stepped out of the room to fetch some pamphlets, Marigold flapped its wings and delivered a new line. "Horatio told Lucy he loves her." Horatio's jaw dropped. Had he told Lucy that? In a drunken phone call? Or had he just fantasized about confessing his secret crush? He couldn't even remember the details. But the parrot's voice was so sure, so confident, that Horatio flushed bright red. Mortification spilled over him in waves. He sputtered, that can't, we haven't." But there was no one to hear his defense except the parrot, who just cocked its head as though thoroughly entertained. When Dr. Rosenthal returned, Horatio could barely look her in the eye. He thanked her for the pamphlets, scheduled a follow-up appointment, and hurried out, with the parrot in its carrier. His mind raced. Was the parrot revealing new secrets, or was it making them up? For that matter, was there a difference if other people believed them anyway? Over the next week, Horatio followed Dr. Rosenthal's advice meticulously. He introduced new, harmless phrases like "good day," "lovely weather," and "time for tea." He rewarded Marigold with treats each time the bird repeated these benign expressions. Whenever Marigold drifted toward any shameful revelations, Horatio gave no response. No gasp, no scolding, he simply turned away or walked out of the room, ignoring the parrot's attempts at shock value. It was difficult. He felt his pulse pound and sweat bead at his temples whenever Marigold threatened to unearth another humiliating secret. But he gritted his teeth, determined not to give the bird the satisfaction. Gradually, the parrot seemed to lose interest in quoting Horatio's every discomfiting remark. It would still sprinkle them in occasionally, but not with the same exuberance. On the rare occasions when Horatio slipped up shouting, "Oh, shut up," in exasperation, the parrot's eyes lit up as if to say, "Aha! There's the reaction I wanted." Horatio learned to stifle his indignation, channeling all his frustration into forcing a bored expression. As if hearing Horatio's Netflix history is full of sappy musicals was no big deal, the final test came one afternoon when Horatio's boss, Mr. Guffington, rang his buzzer to deliver some paperwork in person. Horatio's heart hammered like a boxer punching the bag. Memories of Marigold's vile commentary about his boss hovered in the forefront of his mind. He half expected the parrot to greet Mr. Guffington with a roared insult. But to his relief, when the door opened, Marigold simply squawked, "Ugly weather." Horatio forced himself to stay perfectly calm, greeting his boss with a polite smile while ignoring the parrot entirely. Mr. Guffington, who had never actually met Marigold, gave a tight nod and handed over some forms. He frowned a bit at the parrot's presence, but said nothing. Horatio had never felt more relieved. Then, just as he was about to close the door, a voice squawked from behind him. Horatio froze in horror. Certain his career was about to end on the spot, he waited for the final word, signature. But it didn't come. Instead, Marigold let out a prolonged burp-like sound and followed it up with, "Time for tea." Mr. Guffington's severe eyebrows rose. Horatio plastered on what he hoped was a calm grin. "Guess the bird's a bit of a tea connoisseur," he ventured awkwardly. Mr. Guffington grunted in confusion and turned to leave, bounding down the stairs. As soon as the footsteps faded, Horatio leaned against the wall, almost dizzy with relief. Later that evening, Lucy knocked on the door. She stepped inside with a hopeful smile, and Horatio ushered her toward the sofa. He was exceedingly conscious that at any moment Marigold might blurt out something mortifying, like, "Horatio told Lucy he loves her." Lucy seemed to pick up on his tension. She gently said, "Don't worry. If the parrot says anything weird, I'll just ignore it. I know you've been working hard to train him." As they sat down, an uneasy silence lingered. Lucy took a deep breath. "I heard from Oliver that your boss visited you today. Were you worried Marigold would say something, unflattering?" Horatio nodded. "Terrified, but the parrot held back. Mostly. I owe it to Dr. Rosenthal's training plan and the fact that I didn't freak out when it almost, well, you know." Lucy looked at Marigold, who was quietly preening its wings. "A really beautiful bird. And you're a good person for trying to do right by it even with all the trouble. I think it's kind of sweet how much effort you're putting into this." He felt a blush creep across his cheeks. "Yeah, well, it's not exactly purely altruistic. I just don't want to be the biggest laughingstock on Maplewood Lane." Lucy's gaze softened. "I get it. But I also know from personal experience that it's terrifying to have secrets exposed. At least yours revolve around everyday slip-ups. Still, if you ever want to talk about anything, or if you do want to eventually admit that—" She paused. Horatio's pulse fluttered. Lucy bit her lip, eyes locked on him. He gathered his courage. "What the parrot said in Dr. Rosenthal's office, about me telling you something." Lucy nodded. "Yes, that—" A hush fell. Even Marigold seemed oddly silent, its head swiveling between Horatio and Lucy as though aware of the tension in the air. Horatio swallowed hard and continued, "Well, maybe that's a secret I'd like to share on my own terms, rather than having my parrot broadcast it." He saw a faint smile tug at Lucy's lips. "I'd appreciate that." So, with the parrot perched just a few feet away, Horatio took a leap of faith. "Lucy," he began softly, I do have feelings for you. I'm sorry if that's too abrupt." Before he could finish, Marigold let out an excited squawk, as if prompting him to say more. Horatio shot the parrot a look, feeling his nerves spike anew, but pressed on. "I've liked you for a while. I never meant for you to hear it from a silly bird." Lucy's laugh was warm, comforting. "I suppose it's better to hear it directly, but now that I know, I can just say, I like you too." A glimmer in her eyes suggested genuine affection. "Maybe we can see where that goes, minus any unexpected parrot confessions?" Relief and excitement surged through Horatio. He nodded, swallowing around the sudden lump in his throat. Marigold, clearly picking up on the softening mood, observed them with intense curiosity. After a moment, the parrot bobbed its head and simply chirped, "Lovely weather, time for tea," as though imparting approval for the newfound closeness between its human companions. A wave of calm flowed through Horatio. For once, the parrot's words were relaxing rather than mortifying. He realized that while he couldn't erase every humiliating moment the parrot had already shared, he could work to prevent future catastrophes. But, more importantly, he had learned that some secrets deserved to be aired, just not out of a parrot's beak in front of the entire neighborhood. Sure, the building's residents still viewed him as the guy with the oversharing parrot, at least for the time being. He braced himself for months of sly winks and subtle teasing references to hairpieces and rom-com tears. But as he stared at Lucy, who gave his hand a gentle squeeze, he decided it might be worth the occasional embarrassment, if it meant forging closer relationships with those who actually got him. In fact, maybe the parrot had done him a strange favor by letting Lucy in on his otherwise tightly guarded feelings. Later that night, after Lucy left, Horatio gently covered Marigold's cage. Routine demanded that he say, "Good night, Marigold," but the bird had already drifted into a quiet rest, its head tucked under one bright wing. Horatio dosed the apartment lights. It was still the same dingy place with clanking pipes and peeling wallpaper, but somehow it felt cozier. The secrets had been aired, or at least enough of them. And though he worried what new revelations the parrot might produce tomorrow, he knew he was no longer alone in wrestling them. He had Lucy in his corner, plus a new set of skills to gently guide the parrot toward more polite conversation. As he stood there in dim lamplight, Horatio realized that, ironically, the parrot's indiscretions had brought about changes he could only describe as positive. He felt lighter, somehow, as if the burden of secrecy had been partially lifted. And though he certainly didn't plan on forging any more signatures or wearing questionable hairpieces, he mused that it might not be so terrible to let people see his vulnerabilities now and then. Marigold gave one last soft chirp from behind the covered cage. "Lovely weather," it whispered groggily, unconsciously repeating its newly learned, inoffensive phrase. Horatio laughed under his breath. He quietly whispered back, "Yes, it is." Then he tiptoed to his bedroom, feeling a smile spread across his face, one that looked worlds away from the polite, forced grin he used to show the neighbors. After all, what was the worst that could happen next? The parrot might reveal another, slightly mortifying secret or two, but somewhere along the line, Horatio realized he'd learned to let go of some pride, let love in, and trust that no secret was worth chaining himself up in fear. When he closed the bedroom door, he was determined to get a good night's sleep, and for once, Marigold let him. Once the parrot was under that cover, it succumbed to stillness, no humiliating squawks or confessions echoing through the apartment. The hush was a blessing. Horatio crawled into bed, closed his eyes, and thought about Lucy's warm smile. With that comforting image, he let himself drift into a peaceful slumber, no longer quite so worried what secrets tomorrow might bring. Because he suspected Marigold might finally be learning. And so was he,